No matter how long you've known Jesus, no matter what you know about him, no matter how great you think he is, there's one thing I can guarantee you. He's better. He's better. His love is deeper. His compassion is wider. His understanding of you is more complete. He's better. And every time I think I have him figured out, we read a story like we're going to read today, where he goes and does something that makes no sense to me whatsoever. And yet after it is all said and done, I can't imagine him acting any other way. If you have your Bibles, I hope that you do. John chapter 2. If you don't have your Bible, back on the communion table where we have communion to go. For those of you who are used to taking communion every week, there's communion back there. You can grab a Bible, grab a notebook, grab a pen. We're going to be in John chapter 2 today. Start reading in verse number 1. And on the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. And when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take to the master of the feast." So they took it, and when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. This is the first of his signs." Jesus did as Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Jenny owns an advertising company, and so it's not unusual for people to come to her and try to figure out they're going to launch a new product or they want to proclaim a message. They come to her and ask for assistance, and her partner in Tulsa try to figure out what is the best way to get this message out. And her specific skill and expertise is spending the least amount of money to reach the broadest number of people that are potential clients or customers for her. And so one of the first things you have to understand whenever you're going to launch a new product or launch a campaign of some sort is you have to figure out what is the scope of the message. How many people need to hear this? And so if you're just a local company, a local shop maybe that sells things, then you need to keep your message very local. And yet if you're a major conglomerate that's going to launch a new product, or you want your message to be spread all around the world, then you're going to have to spend a great deal of money. And so in a local campaign, just $25 on Facebook could get your message out to a good number of people. But if you have a national or international campaign, then you're going to have to spend millions upon millions, and we get a percentage of millions of dollars to get that message out. Well, Jesus had a message that was from the very beginning of time, before the foundations of the earth itself. God had a plan to put Jesus in place to take away the sin of the world. And the end game of this message is that a day will come in which every tongue, tribe, and nation will bow before him, recognizing who he actually is. How would you get that message out? If you have a message that is a global message and you want to impact as many people as you possibly can for them to understand what is going on, what would be your first event? Well, for me, my first event would be it. It would be a major event. I would sink all my resources into the one major moment in which we're going to launch this campaign in such a powerful way that then hopefully momentum will get to running till we just take over everything immediately. And yet, Jesus, instead of running a 2-minute commercial in the middle of the Olympics right before Michael Phelps swam his last race, Jesus launches his public ministry with the equivalent of a private tweet that can't even be shared or screenshotted. Just almost a holy wink to a few people. And the end result of that is his disciples believed. The first couple of verses kind of give us the setting of what's going on. On the third day, so this is actually the end of the week. So on the third day is 2 days following the last passage that we studied in the calling of Nathanael. So on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. Now, notice it says Cana of Galilee. That because Cana of Galilee was so small, they had to tell people this is Cana of Galilee, right? It's kind of like Paris of Arkansas, right? You don't want people to be confused about what you're talking about. And so this was an insignificant place that's actually called the place of the reeds. You know those reeds that grow up by the river? It's like a weed that takes over. That's a small place. When they name you after the weed that's grown there, that could be funny in other ways. When they name you after that, that's a small and insignificant town, right? And the smaller a town is, the more important a wedding is. Jenny and I got married in her front yard, her parents' front yard. And so we invited about 120 people. And so we had 60 apiece, right? And so I'd grown up here. I knew a lot of people, had a lot of people. So I had to narrow down my list. 60 people. I mean, I couldn't invite everybody. I had to narrow it down to just 60 people that would bring the best gifts. And so I had to figure out who those 60 were. I couldn't invite every old Sunday school teacher, every old basketball coach or friend. I had to narrow it down to 60. And after I got my 60 narrowed down, Jenny then invited her whole community, plus some people. Hall Creek, Oklahoma is so small that if you will look on the census data of LaFleur County, it does not even have a line, right? Like literally, if you look it up, I think it just says you. Like that's the only people that are living in Hall Creek. This is a small place. Well, you know, a wedding that takes place in Fort Smith is for me, it's about a 20-minute affair. But if you're attending the wedding, maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 2 hours, but it's just part of a day. In a bigger place, there's a lot of weddings, and so if you have to go, it's just a couple hours. But in Hall Creek, it's everything. It's a whole day affair. To my knowledge, in the 20 years or so I've been around Jenny, there have been 3 weddings in Hall Creek. Jenny's brother, and Jenny's sister. There's been 3 weddings, and those are major events. Everything kind of circles around those events. Well, in Cana of Galilee, it wasn't just an all-day affair. A wedding at that time lasted a week. You missed 2 football games. A week. And the way it would begin is the wedding party would be set in the day before the wedding. The day before the wedding, the groom and all his party would gather together, and the master of ceremonies, the best man, was the master of ceremonies. Thankfully, we've smartened up from that, because most best men should not be the master of anything. And so the best man was the master of ceremonies, and he would lead a procession to the bride's house, torch lit at night. How cool is that? You should pick up this tendency. This is a great thing, right? In some way, that gives us an image of what eternity is going to be like, that we, the bride of Christ, are now waiting just for the first glimpse of the light of the groom coming back to this earth to rescue us, right? And so the torchlit procession would come to the bride's house, and whenever they got there, there'd be a ceremony, almost like the giving away of the bride. Speeches would be given, and then everybody would gather together, the groom's side and the bride's side, and they would then process back to the groom's house. In much the same way that Jesus will come get us, but he will not stay here. He will take us to be with him, and we'll go back there. And so everybody comes to the bride's house, and the next day is full of feasting and festivities that finally culminates that night in the actual marriage ceremony. But the couple isn't swooped off onto a honeymoon. Oh no, they get to spend the first week right there among their friends and family, celebrating to the best of their possibilities in that moment of what it now means to be lawfully a husband and wife. And the whole community is surrounded around. It's a big event. And you can almost see how this happens. That somebody of great wealth can hire servants, can have all this food, can have the best of everything, and put on the spotless wedding. But somebody of a little bit more meager means still wants to give their kids the best they possibly can. And so they try to catch up in places they can, but they try to have as many people as they can. And so they might hire a servant or two, but then aunts and uncles fill in. And friends of the family fill in and trying to put on the best wedding that they possibly can. And a few days into this wedding, a problem arises. So Mary comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, they have no wine. Now, in that, it doesn't sound too chaotic for us. All right, so a couple days later, they ran out of wine. But in that society, it was a big deal. In that society, as a matter of fact, if you invited somebody to a wedding party, and you did not provide for them what you said you would provide, they could actually sue you. Try that the next time you're at a bad party. Just call your lawyer up. And this party did not live up to what I expected it to live up to. This sounds very American, doesn't it? We're going to file suit now, right? And so whenever Mary comes and says they have no wine, there is a legal ramification of what's going on here. But more than that, this is a culture full of pride. And there's a great danger for shame here. Shame that would begin to overfill. You can hear how it happens. Mary is there, and there's a couple possibilities of how she found out they had no wine. The women would sit closer to the kitchen. The men would be further away, same way y'all do Thanksgiving. And so the women would sit close to the kitchen, and maybe she just overheard that they were running out of wine. But more likely, Mary was probably related to the wedding party, this unnameless couple. And so chances are she was helping, she was serving, she was being a good friend, a good cousin here, trying to be one of the servants that they wouldn't have to pay in that moment. And so she knew the moment that they began to run out of wine. And you can see what was about to take place. Very slowly, word would leak out from the kitchen that they were out of wine. And some of the more dignified guests would just quietly just exit, and they would leave. And some of the more loud, outspoken guests would begin to voice their displeasure. And eventually the couple would begin to hear what was going on. And back in the kitchen, it would be an aunt, because it's always some aunt. And she'd be the first one to say, well, I knew he wasn't good enough for her. And then the other aunt of the groom would hear, you're blaming this on him? Have you seen her taste? Nobody could afford her. And the fight would be on. And it would ripple out from there into the party, into the living room, into everything that's taking place. And before long, this couple then would have to choose sides. Are they going to support their mamas and their aunts? Are they going to support their spouse and their bride and the groom? And they would be torn apart. And I'm not saying it would have ended the marriage, but a marriage like this is so fragile. When a marriage begins, it's so fragile. It's one of the important reasons that when marriages begins, young people, you need to have people come alongside of you to learn these skills, to how to handle chaos, how to handle stress, so that later on, when more stressful situations come along, you'll have a framework to use these things. But this young couple didn't have anything. They would have no idea. How do you choose between your mama and your wife? They'd have no clue. And this danger would literally, you can almost see it, ripping this marriage apart. And so Mary understands the legal ramifications. She understands the shame. She understands the consequences of this couple. She understands this is a serious moment. And so she comes to Jesus and says, they ain't got no wine. And Jesus then responds to her in a way that you should not respond to your mama. Jesus goes, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour's not come yet. You can hear the harshness in it. Now, some translators have tried to soften it, and they have tried to put here, Madam, what does this have to do with us? And that's a fine translation. It's probably not as harsh as you and I would make it out to be. I wouldn't know. I'm not calling my mama or my wife woman. It's probably not as harsh as this sounds, but you and I are right in thinking this doesn't sound right. You would think in this moment that Jesus would say, Mom, don't bring me into this, with a compassion and a softness. But instead, there is a lack of intimacy that's here. When he says woman, there's a distance that's here. Now, Jesus eventually will go on to say that his family is those that do the will of his Father. We got to remember something about Jesus here, that Jesus does not love Mary more than he loves me and you. Now I love my mama more than I love you, but I ain't Jesus. Jesus doesn't. There's nothing about Mary here that makes her more special or more unique than anybody else. She is just like us. I know that's offensive to some of you in your background and your training. I'm sorry, but it's the Bible. And so Jesus here is speaking, beginning to show a distance between himself and Mary. Why is that? And oh, how much did that hurt her? A mama never forgets something like this, ever. You can sense the pain. And yet, what gave her the faith here to come to Jesus? It's a beautiful picture, by the way. This wasn't her problem, but she took somebody else's problem to Jesus. You want to know how to help somebody? Take their problem to Jesus. You want to know how to help yourself? Take your own problem to Jesus. And so she takes their problem to Jesus. What faith? Now, don't be confused. Don't buy into this ridiculous concept that she knew all the miracles that Jesus had done throughout his childhood, as though Jesus was playing games. We have no testimony of that in Scripture. It's not like Jesus was sitting there killing his sister, then bringing her back to life as a child, or levitating her brother, or sitting in the classroom going, watch this, and the clock all of a sudden being 3 o'clock, and they're out for summertime vacation. We have no testimony whatsoever of Jesus playing games with his godhood in the midst of his childhood. He didn't go that way. Jesus lived his life incognito. And apart from a miraculous birth and one scene at the temple whenever he was a young child, as far as we know, he never did anything miraculous until now. And yet Mary, maybe remembering the words of Zechariah, this great promise that her son would show compassion and have mercy. Mary, maybe remembering the words of the angel, knowing there was something special and unique about Jesus. Mary brings somebody else's problem to Jesus and says they have no wine. And Jesus goes, Mom, I got 99 problems, but wine ain't mine. I mean, that's a loose translation. And then he says this interesting phrase, my hour has not yet come. What does that mean? I can almost guarantee you Mary had no idea. That she had no idea. Doesn't it make you feel good that Jesus said a lot of things that Mary and the disciples had no clue what he was talking about? Don't feel bad. Whenever you read Scripture and you go, I have no idea what this means. Nobody knew what this meant. My hour has not yet come. What does that mean? And yet, thankfully, because of Scripture, we have an understanding. You see in the book of John, the first 12 chapters, remember, chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 is the prologue. That's the opening sentence. And from chapter 1, verse 19, all the way through chapter 12, that's the book of signs, where the gospel writer is going to show us 7 signs, kind of proving the divinity of Jesus. This is sign number 1. And yet at the end of that sign, starting in chapter number 13, all the way through the rest of the book, you have the book of the Passion, where it shows his suffering, his final teaching, his death, burial, and resurrection. And so you have that moment. It's very interesting that in chapter number 12 and verse number 23, in that moment, having completed the 7 signs, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem and he tells his disciples, my hour has now come. And from that moment on, we get the story of this final crucifixion of what happens, of how the trial occurs, how the suffering takes place, how he ends up on the cross, the resurrection that then happens. It's in that moment that he says, my hour has come, that he starts talking about his crucifixion. So in this moment, when Jesus looks at Mary and says, my hour has not yet come, what he's saying, I think, is, it's not time for me to die yet, Mama. Don't take me there yet. You see, for 30-some years, he had lived in obscurity, lived behind the scenes. Luke 2:52 would say he grew in knowledge and wisdom and favor and stature with God and man, that this was his task, to be an obedient son, to be a carpenter, to really have nobody know about him. But a day was going to come in which he was going to step into the public eye and make himself known. And we are right on the verge of this at that moment. And it seems as though that Jesus has a plan of how that's going to take place. And Mary in this moment is trying to push him a little bit faster than he wants to be pushed. And he says, my hour has not yet come. What he's saying to her in that moment is, you don't want to speed this up, Mama. And if there's anybody that didn't want to speed this up more than Jesus, or as much as Jesus, it was Mary. She had no idea her son was going to die. She had no idea that by requesting him to do something at this wedding, that would actually begin to start the clock ticking to his death. And so he says, my hour has not yet come. And where I really struggle with this story is I'm a big believer in the sovereignty of God and God's divine plan and his divine purpose. And what I kind of struggle with here is it's almost like Jesus saying, I'm not doing this yet. And yet Mary goes, hey, could you do this for me? And it's almost as though God himself changed his cosmic plan for Mary. It should give us some hope in praying that for whatever reason, God has given us his heart and his ear, and we can say things that seemingly does change the course of history. But I love the faith of Mary here. Jesus says, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Mary basically looks at him with this blank stare of, I have no idea what you just said, but hey, servants, do whatever he says. This faith now that Jesus is going to act, that somehow she knows, again, maybe it's the words of Zechariah, that she just knows the character and nature of Jesus, that he is moved with compassion toward broken and hurting people, that nothing kind of influences and affects the heart of God like somebody who has experienced the shame and the chaos that is to come. And so Mary looks at the servants and basically says, I don't know what he's going to do, but there's a good chance that he's going to do something, so whatever he tells you, you do that. And so Jesus, I don't know why. Jesus looks at the servants, and he sees off kind of in the side of the room these 6 large jars. The text tells us they're used for Jewish purification. As a Jew would enter into the room. Remember, it was a dusty society. You're walking everywhere. As the Jew would enter into the room, they were called to be holy, to be set apart. And before they could eat, they would have to dip their hands in this. Now, I'm sure there was some cleanliness, some hygienic reasons for this, obviously to get the dust off, but that would work for like 3 people, right? But everybody had to dip their hands in. This wasn't so much hygienic as much as it was a religious act. Now, a Jewish person was showing themselves separate, set apart, holy. They were called to be different in some way. They began to turn this into believing that they were of a higher class than everybody else. This was a privilege in a Jewish home to be able to do this. And Jesus looks over and he sees these jars and says, well, I'll just use those. Now, he could have done it however he wanted to. You know, the widow at Zarephath, that every time she went to get some manna or some oil, there was always just one more serving left. Jesus could have made the bottles of wine that way, where they just never poured empty. But instead, he intentionally chose to use these specific jars, and he told the servants, said, go get those jars and fill them up with water. And the text says they filled them all the way up to the brim. There would be no tricks going on here. This isn't like a Kool-Aid, where Jesus is going to pour in a little holy power and make a box of wine in this moment. They were filled to the brim with nothing else to come in. And Jesus then tells the servants, hey, take that, dip some water out, dip some out, and take it to the master of ceremonies. To which if I'm a servant in that moment, I go, will you do that? And this master of ceremonies is kind of a hothead. This is a party he's helping put on. I'm not going to take some water to him and pretend as though it is wine. And yet, for whatever reason, out of obedience, the servants do this. They take it to the master of ceremony, and the text says the master of ceremony is overwhelmed by the taste, because the water has been changed into wine. But notice what the text says. He didn't know what had happened. The person putting on the party had no idea. And he calls out to the groom, and he brings the groom over, now showing who would have been accountable. Had this gone wrong, who would have been accountable? It would have been the groom. And he calls the groom over. And he says, hey, most people serve their best wine first, and after everybody kind of gets a little tipsy, they bring out the cheap stuff. But you have now saved the best for last. And the groom has no idea what's happened. The groom never knew they were running out of wine. The groom probably didn't even know who Jesus was. The groom had no clue. The groom is dancing when all of a sudden somebody calls him over and begins to praise him. And like any good guy would do, he just takes it and says, thank you. Takes all the credit and then goes back. Now, what amazes me about this story is, notice, nobody knew about it. There wasn't an iPhone filming everything. The master of ceremony didn't know. The couple didn't know. The couple, as far as we knew, never found out. Which means if they became followers of Jesus, that then one day maybe they died and went to heaven, and whenever they got to heaven, maybe Peter walked over and said, you'll never believe what happened at your wedding. And they had no clue. But why? Why is this the way? The text says there in verse 11 and 12 that this was Jesus' first sign, first of 7, remember? And that the disciples saw it and they believed. Just a few of them believed. Why? Well, I can't help but think that, remember, it's a sign. So that means what's going on, there's more meaning to what's going on. There's more meaning in the detail than we would ever even begin to imagine. So it's no accident here that Jesus used these 6 vats for Jewish purification. 6. Notice that's no accident. That number is no accident. 6. It's the number for imperfection. It's the number for humanity. You and I were created on the 6th day. The 6th commandment is you shall not murder. Remember, the Antichrist, the number is 666. 6 shows an incompleteness. It's lacking one. We need something else. This itself is not enough. There were 6 tablets here for Jewish purification, 6 vats that are filled with water now for Jewish purification, that as a good Jew were to come in, they were to dip their hands in there to show an outward cleansing of what they would hope would cleanse them on the inside. But no outward act could ever do that on the inside of who they were. The Jewish system here was now lacking. They needed something more. It might point to something greater, but of its own volition, it could not offer what it was promising. They needed a 7th jar, and that was Jesus. And so Jesus takes these 6 jars and fills them with water. And this water of Judaism was turned into this wine of joy of Christianity. Why wine? Why not grape juice? It'd make my Baptist friends feel a whole lot more safe. Why wine? Well, wine was the sign of celebration. The sign of joy. And in much the same way that maybe you, if you get good news, you go over and maybe you break open a bottle of wine. I pop a Coke. But either way, it still communicates the same kind of happiness, this joy, this celebration all throughout the Old Testament. It's a picture of the Jewish nation, of the fruitfulness, of the success, of the joy of God. Remember in the opening book of Esther when the king is trying to convince his people to go to this ungodly war, how does he convince them? He shows them the kingdom is powerful because for a week he allows them to drink all the wine that they want. Even in the New Testament, the picture of new wine is this picture of joy, of celebration, of greatness. And notice what Jesus did here. 20 to 30 gallons in these 6 jars. That means between 120 and 180 gallons. That is 756 bottles of wine at a small wedding. What were they going to do with that? They were going to have a really good time. And even in the midst of this small celebration, Jesus gives a supply that is far greater than they can ever even begin to imagine. And he begins to point his disciples almost with a holy wink to say, you have no idea who I am. I am greater. I am better than you can ever even begin to imagine. What kind of God? What kind of God ignores the Acropolis in Athens and ignores the temple in Jerusalem and ignores the seat of power in Rome? What kind of God makes his announcement in Cana of Galilee? Jesus. What kind of God is moved with compassion upon his mother who asked him to do something? What kind of God would humble himself into subservience and obedience to her? Jesus. What kind of God would even care about this nameless couple, much less the shame that they might face or the legal ramifications? What kind of God would lower himself to actually have compassion upon his own creation? What kind of God would care about what's going on within your life, would care about the details of who you are, would not only ask you to pray about the details of your life, but actually begin to involve himself in the details of life? What kind of God would spin this world into motion and then out of his love and compassion actually step down into it and take on our sin? What kind of God is this? Oh, to God who is far greater than you can ever even begin to imagine. It is a God who has a compassion to detail and a care and a concern for your life that you can never even begin to fathom. What this means to us today is pray about whatever you need to pray about, because if you care about it, God cares about it. You need to understand that God is active, involved in your life, dealing with the details of your life. And it is no accident that this situation came to rest. It is no accident how these situations just happen to go the way they want to go. God is involved in what is going on. It means God knows your pain. He knows your sorrow. He knows the heartache that is going on within your life. And don't think it's too small. Just because your pain doesn't compare to somebody else's pain, don't negate what's going on within your life. Take those concerns to Jesus. It means God cares about your friends and what's happening in their lives. Don't just become concerned about your own life and your own will and what's going on. Take their concerns to Jesus as well. It means even if you're from the most insignificant place that you've ever been and you think, who would ever care about me? God cares about you in a way you can't even begin to fathom. It means if you think you have God figured out, you don't have a clue what you're talking about, because he is far greater than you could ever even begin to imagine. God is greater. He is greater. And in this day, notice what happened, because it so relates to our day. My hour is not yet come, he says. But Mary says, hey, if you don't hurry up, this joy is going to fall apart. This celebration is going to turn to chaos, Jesus. If you don't hurry up, if you don't move right now, if you don't take a step, chaos is going to break loose. And so Jesus, out of his great love, takes a step forward toward his death to keep the party going. And even as all these people are celebrating, behind his smile, he knows. And he is beginning to experience the sour suffering of his own cross. Edward Clowney, the great theologian, says that in this wedding, Jesus, in the midst of celebration, began to sip on his own sorrow, so that you and I, living in this fallen, sorrow-filled world, can begin to sip on the joy of what is to come. Jesus turned water into wine, and nobody really knew about it except a few disciples, and they began to believe even more. And so should we. Would you bow your heads in prayer with me?